So now we are going to select our main HV emit and our particle emitter, and we want to go to its object properties. If we can go to the Dynamics tab, go to that emitter, and select it. And I want to change its birth rate down to a very low level, and that way we're getting the fastest calculations possible. And of course, as we increase that birth rate, it will take longer to calculate, but by starting out with a low number, we'll be able to get a really good idea of where those collisions are happening. So I'm going to bring down our birth rate, and let's start out with 100, just to see if that's enough. If we need to, we can either reduce or increase that amount depending on the calculations, and of course whether or not we're getting an accurate enough amount of particles in our scene. What I also want to do is decrease the length of our animation, because right now it's 10 seconds long, which is a little too long, I think, for this specific shot, especially if we wanted to have this quickly moving through as it normally would, whether it was water or smoke, depending on which we use for the HyperVoxels, and we can always just easily switch those out. But I'm going to reduce our frame length to 120 frames, and that way we have a 4-second animation if we're working with 30 frames per second. If we're going to be using this for film, we of course want to change that for a 24 frame per second time length. But I'm going to stick with 30 frames because that can always easily be reduced, and it's a lot easier to reduce frames than it is to increase frames, because you can always use a video editing program to remove those extra frames in there. So let's take a look now just with the 100 particles, and that actually looks pretty good. Of course, now we only have a 4-second animation, so really what we need to do is make a few modifications to our wind effect and possibly even our gravity. So we're going to select our wind object, and now our power is set to 100%. And that was good for a 10-second animation, but now we're down to 4 seconds, so it's a little more than 50% of an increase in the reduction of our time. So what we can do is take our power, and we know we at least need to go beyond the 50%, so that would give us a power of 200, and we have that extra second, so we can add just a little bit more to that. And let's just try 230 and see how well that works out. And I'm going to switch to our camera view so that we can see exactly where these particles are ending up towards the last frames. And it looks like their overall coverage of the scene isn't too bad. Because of course, keep in mind, we will be increasing this overall amount, and since we see particles over here, we know that there will be more than enough. But in case you do want just a little bit more, we can increase that power up to 250. And we can take a look, and now we can see it's really spanning through the scene. But one major thing we notice is that that gravity that we had before is really no longer playing as large of a role. So we can go back to our Objects panel and Properties, and we're going to select that main HV emit, and we want to go and change our gravity to -4 for right now, because of course when we calculate it's going to be a little bit different, and it might not raise up as high. So we're going to start out just by calculating this, and we can figure out what we need to tweak. So I'll just go ahead and click Calculate. And I'm going to switch to our perspective view, and we can see that most of our particles are being held back a little bit more. And we can also see that the gravity does need to be turned down a bit more. And since we had that set to 3, I'm going to use pretty much the same principle we did for the velocity of the wind. and I'm going to set this to a -7. And what I can do is recalculate, and then we can take a look. And if we scrub through, we can definitely see that increase in our gravity, but that also has caused a lot of our particles to not reach as far as they should be, and a lot of them are kind of staying behind, bouncing off. So we can either compensate by decreasing that gravity amount or by increasing the velocity amount of our wind. And it will really work about the same both ways. And it's just kind of playing back and forth between those two options, really depending on how high up you want those particles to go. And now we have a few of them that are really going up pretty high, especially once we hit that certain collision area. So what I also might want to do is turn down that overall collision, where we're going to be sort of creating the opposite type of an effect for that. So I'm going to go to our low poly terrain, which is our collision, and our bounce bind power I'm going to turn down to 175, and then make sure that new group is turned to default so that we're not changing our particles over once they collide to a new group, and we can calculate that and see how it's going to turn out. And if we scrub through, we can see the particles definitely are not reaching as high as they were before, which is more the effect we were looking for, because we don't want them to go too high up in the scene, because that would cover up maybe a little bit too much. And we can see that a few of the particles are reaching towards the end of the scene, or the edges, although it might not be enough. So we can go to that wind object once again, and we just want to adjust the power to something a little bit stronger. Well, I'll do 275, recalculate, and see if we can end up towards the left edge of our screen. And I'm going to close out our object properties panel, see if we can see it just a little bit better. But basically, even though we're getting a little bit of collision at the end, which still looks good, we have the full coverage that we'll need in order to create the proper looking effect. And if we take a look at the overall flow, and also paying attention to where our camera is located, and of course where those different peaks are, we can get a better idea of where all of this is going. And that looks pretty good. So I'm going to save this scene out where we're at right now, and then increase our particle amount and the birth rate, so we have the amount of particles that we need for the scene. And then I can go ahead and bake those directly onto the object, and then we can start refining our HyperVoxels. Now I've calculated our particles, if we take a look, the object properties for them at 600 for the birth rate. But one thing you will notice is that we're really not seeing any of them until about frame 60, so halfway into the animation. So the first 2 seconds are just pretty much still, and then the last 2 seconds we will have all of these particles coming in. So whether or not that's the sort of effect you would want is of course entirely up to you. There's of course an advantage to having those first 2 seconds with a little bit of calm, and with all of the wind animation that we're going to have on the trees, which we'll be taking a look at once we switch back into view, it'll give us a really nice transition between just kind of the peace of the scene and then moving into more of the tragic and destructive outcome. Another thing that would be really nice about that too is it'll give a little bit of a build-up if we're using audio with it, and that way we could just have sort of a slight rumble that maybe just starts to progress, and then we can see once we get towards the area where we can have those particles coming in, we can increase that noise level, and also do a little bit of a camera shake if we wanted to as well. Since I'm pretty much going to stick with these particles, if we have enough of them, depending on the way the HyperVoxels look, we may need to create more, but let's take a look at modifying the HyperVoxels right now so we can get an idea of whether or not this is enough particles to complete the scene. Because it may not be. If you want the best effect, it's usually better to have more particles with smaller HyperVoxels, and those will blend together a little bit better. You could also go as far as having these particles, once they collide, create a new emitter which will cast even more particles, but that really depends on, of course, production time and the time you have to calculate these effects. So I am going to wait to bake these, which we can see we can do within the File menu just by saving the motion and adjusting some of our other settings. But we're just going to take a look at the HyperVoxels and make sure this is going to be a correct amount. So I'll just go ahead and close this out, go back and select our particles. We're going to open up the volumetrics panel, Control F6. And we can double click on HyperVoxels and turn that back on. Since we had it off from a previous render, we're going to turn Viper back on so we can get a preview of what we're working on. And I'm going to increase our preview size to 640 by 480 and also change this to normal mode so that we can get a much better detailed look at how everything is interacting. Now if you need to just edit those base parameters and you're still just kind of playing around with it, then usually the draft mode will work really well for that. And then once you want to start refining the little details, then you want to move up to the normal mode. But right now we can see with our current particles that it may not be enough to create the most realism we can, because we have these separation areas in our different particles, and we might be able to just increase our particle size and have a little more blending between those. I'm going to just go ahead and bring those up, and we can see it looks much better in this area, definitely along the back, but of course that's going to be all cut off. So what we're really seeing is these top areas that are shooting off. And whether or not we want the stretch amount to be that much, we can play around with those different values. And we also need to keep in mind if we want to have any other sort of effect on this. And basically that's under our hypertexture. Well, right now we really don't have any texture effects. Well, there are a lot available. We could use turbulence just to add a bit of a jitter in there. Billowing is something we may not want to use for this, just because it is a more isolated effect to individual particles and not so much to an entire volume like this. Plus we can see those areas kind of spanning out and creating sort of an explosion effect, so it might not be the best specifically for this area. We just have it displays. We could have it dissolve over time, which we're really not going to have it do. We could have the velocity translate, which will work well with the stretching effect and give us a nice little bit of motion. And then we could also do dissolve and expand, but since we don't want to dissolve this at all, I think the best bet is really just to use turbulence. Plus the scene is going to be very quick. We're going to have a bit of motion blur, which we'll be taking a look at within the camera properties, and also which camera settings we want to use specifically to render that out. But let's take a look. I think our sizing is about correct for our initial particle, but whether or not we want this amount of detail in our overall effect caused by the texture that we have, we may need to modify and scale that down to create a little more detail in there. So let's go ahead and take our X, Y, and Z and bring those all the way down to 0.5. So just kind of cutting that in half and seeing if it's too little or too much. And it looks like with some of our more isolated areas, it's not going to look correct. It doesn't look very good. So let's go ahead and increase that value up to 0.8 because it didn't look all that bad when we were up at 1 meter. And of course, adding that little bit of animation in there with the turbulence will also help. So that looks pretty good if we wanted to be using a smoke effect. What we also need to keep in mind is the way we're going to be shading this and matching it up to our scene illumination. Some of our areas that are mostly in shadow might be a little too dark because we kind of have sort of an overcast type sky where there's a lot of even distribution of light. So we would need to match those settings for our material to make that look a little bit better. And we can go into our shading for that. And there's a lot of different things we can adjust to get that to look correct. And we may want to just darken these up a little bit if we're going to be having more of a smoke type effect. So we can just bring down that base color to something a little bit darker. If we wanted to, we could go and bring that down a little bit more, something even darker than what we have, which might look more realistic. It really depends on just the overall blend of everything together. And what we could also do is just switch this to an entirely different type of material. Surprisingly, we actually can use what we currently have to almost simulate water. If I bring this all the way up to white and add just a little bit of a blue tint to it, we can simulate very fast-moving water. Of course, we'll have to modify the texture just a little bit, and maybe that effect speed. And typically with more of a water effect, you would want to have more particles, and we might end up adding more anyway. But just by looking right now, we can take a look at that overall effect. And now we can see by increasing that thickness, it really brings a lot more volume to what we currently have, just kind of filling in those areas. We could also decrease the amount. And if we take a look, it looks a little bit more like fast-moving water now. So we could have that water rushing through the scene. And we could always add some other effects in there too to make it look more realistic. But with that velocity stretching that we have, it definitely looks more realistic than we would have gotten out of this effect in previous versions of Lightwave. So overall, that actually doesn't look too bad. So we can render that out and see what that would look like with that sort of an effect. And what I want to do is take a look at the motion first and just do a quick preview of the animation. And for that, I'm going to switch to draft mode. And what we want to be focusing on is the speed of our hypertexture. And now 100 might be too much, so I'm going to set that down to 50 to begin with. And the amplitude we can leave at 100. But what we want to do is just go ahead and create a quick preview. And that's going to render out every single frame and give us an idea of that motion. So we'll just wait for this to finish up and we can take a look at it. Now if we take a look at the finished render, which because of the frame rates between the recording and the output, and of course the preview itself, this might not show up entirely accurate to the correct frame rate because this is playing at 30 frames per second and the recording is much lower. But it gives us a really good idea of exactly how these particles are flowing. And we can also really tell that we are going to need more particles in the scene. So we will need to add to that birth rate and then recalculate. If we take a look, we mainly want to focus on halfway through the animation. And really we can tell where those collision objects are And once it starts to kind of crawl over the edge in one of the cliffs that we have, that's pretty much what we're going to start to see. So you also want to consider the length of the animation and whether or not that's enough to show this effect. And I think it will be good enough. But right now, by looking at this really low quality render, it is difficult to tell whether or not the effect speed is too high or too low. So for that, we might have to render out with the normal mode and not the draft. But of course, I am going to be increasing that particle amount and then recalculating and re-rendering. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we can come back into HyperVoxels and take a look at the scene and then make modifications as needed. So we can go ahead and close this out. We want to open up the object properties for our emitter, and right now we have 600 for our birth rate, and I really think we need at least twice as much. Maybe a little less, maybe a little more, but it really depends on how much time you want to spend calculating, and of course rendering out the overall scene, because sometimes, depending on the budget of production, you might not be able to render out that full quality if you don't have the correct resources available. And this is a 4-second animation, so it's not that bad. If we would have stuck with the 300 frame, that'd be a little bit different, because 10 seconds of rendering hypervoxels and calculating all those particles can take a lot longer, especially when you're rendering at film resolution and the HD frames, along with the view scene and all of that together. So there's just lots of things to consider. But I'm going to go ahead and make some modifications to our birth rate, calculate till I get to a point where I feel that it looks acceptable.